Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just wait for another minute or so for folks to take their seats. It doesn't have to be total silence, except for the music. Well, my name is Michael Crow. I'm the president of Arizona State University. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of ASU, on behalf of the Science Foundation Arizona organization, and on behalf of Viva, which is a group of hard-charging, new-thinking individuals, some of whom are in the audience. Here's what we're here to do today. We're trying to make this as simple and as easy as possible. When we look around the United States, what is easy for everyone to see is a lot of stress and a lot of strain about a lot of things that people are talking about, and then there's the one thing that's the most important, which is the economic success of our country. The creation of jobs, the advancement of the United States into a successful, modern, 21st century economy. We already have all the pieces, we have all the ingredients, we have decades of success, we have tremendous opportunity to continue to be successful, so we're at this sort of step function. And as we looked around, we said, who's out there around the country that has been extremely successful as a leader, creative, engaged, adaptive, and involved? And Governor Jeb Bush is the person that we kept coming back to, the person who was creative.
I said that you invited a bunch of other people. I'm the only one that accepted.
No, not true. The governor was saying we invited a bunch of people, and he was the only one that said yes. He was the only one invited, and he did say yes. Because he's the only one that can really have the conversation with us that we would like to have. And the conversation is about, it's not about politics, it's not about Democrats or Republicans, it's not about the election, it's not about who won and which side won, and the red team and the blue team, of which there's these significant teams out there that are playing, and I saw some yellow things on the screens every once in a while, and there's a new yellow team out there. And so there's these teams out there. It's not about any of that. It's about how do you take a place like Arizona, like Florida, and how do you advance towards economic success that allows us to take advantage of everything that makes America great, which is ingenuity, creativity, capitalism, all of those things that make us great. How do you take all those things together and lay the right foundation for success? And in Florida, just like Arizona, two high-growth states, Florida's been growing more quickly and longer. 18 million people or so now. Arizona's just under 7 million people are now, and we're looking at economic futures. It is fair for me to say, from my perspective as president of a university, president of a research university, to say the following. I know the governor shares this view from the conversations that we have had, is that at the end of the day, it will be the outcome of our educational enterprises, the outcome of our entrepreneurs, the outcome of our capitalists and our educators coming together, that at the end of the day will provide the path for success to the United States. So how do we make that happen? So what we have today is, I'll talk before we invite the panel up, is just basically a discussion. The governor's not giving a talk. We're just going to talk. Questions. You're going to ask questions. He's going to talk back and forth. That's the way it's going to work. And so I'd like to invite up next an individual who is going to give us an overview of the situation in Arizona. Several years ago, we began building a relationship with the Milken Institute in Santa Monica because of the way that they look at the future of economies, the way they look at how the American economy ought to move forward, because of the way that they analyze states, and they were contracted by some of us here in Arizona to take a specific look at Arizona. And so I'd like to introduce Ross Duvall. Ross is with the Milken Institute. He's the executive director for economic research. They're an independent think tank. They're nonpartisan also. And he has coordinated the work associated with where is Arizona from a science and technology perspective? Where is Arizona from the perspective of the ability to compete in the new economy? And so, Ross, come on up. So, Ross Duvall.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. And also let me say it's an honor to be on the program with Governor Bush. I once had the opportunity back in 1998, I told him this story a few months ago, speaking after his mother. And the audience asked the first question, and the first question was, is your son running for president? And she answered, which son? Because at that time we thought Governor Bush might be one of them, was running for president. Well, what I want to do is share with you some of the results from the study that we did and released late last year looking at Arizona's place in technology-based economic development. It really provides kind of a benchmark against other leading states in the country, as well as some of the western peer states such as Colorado, Utah, Oregon, and New Mexico. Arizona has a lot of advantages. It has a very low cost of doing business. It's a business-friendly location. It has 3 very strong research universities, as well as significant corporations that invest a lot of R&D in the state. What we used is what we called our State Technology and Science Index, which allows us to evaluate how Arizona is positioned relative to other states in science and technology, along with the ecosystem for converting those assets into companies and high-quality jobs. Overall, there are around 78 different indicators organized into 5 major composite groups that I've listed here. We start with the research and development inputs or assets, as we call them. We also look at the entrepreneurial environment of states around the country and look at Arizona's position. And human capital, I would argue, is a regional economy's most valuable asset. And we look at several different measures of technical talent that are on the ground, as well as the technology concentration and dynamicism, companies that are started, the jobs that are created, and the wages, the high wages associated with those jobs. Lastly, we had a series of recommendations. And let me just say that investing in education is absolutely critical. You'll see that from the numbers that I show you. And it very much involves an integrated approach between government, industries, and the universities working together jointly to achieve those objectives. This first busy chart here gives you Arizona's position in research and development. And these are the raw materials of technology-based economic development. The rank is above the bar in the national context, and there you see several of the western peer states along with some other key states around the country. Arizona performs relatively well in research and development, coming in 13th nationally and 4th amongst the western peer states. Like New Mexico, Arizona gets a significant boost from the flow of federal research dollars into the state and was 10th overall in federal R&D that comes into the state. But there are a couple of areas of concern. One of those is industry research and development investment in the state, where Arizona ranks 23rd, and academic R&D, where the state ranks 26th. And this really hampers the ability to boost commercialization here locally. Now, one of the components of there's 18 that were in that composite I just showed you, was National Science Foundation funding for project proposals. And it's really critical to get an assessment of the quality of research that takes place at universities because it's very competitive. And here the good news is that Arizona ranks 7th. That shows you that the quality of the research universities is very high here, and it's recognized that way nationally by this measure. The challenge is converting more dollars into that research pipeline at universities. The second major composite looks at what we call the risk capital and entrepreneurial investment. And I really believe that a new conceptual framework must be developed that views state and regional economic growth really understanding the role of entrepreneurship, because that is really one of the key distinguishing features as to what states are successful over the long term. And we also include different measures of venture capital availability, both in absolute amounts and in growth in recent years. It also includes business activity in terms of patenting, new business formations, and initial public offerings. And here Arizona comes up 16th overall in the country. And the state has a number of business starts. They're not all in the technology sector, a solid number of patents, And the Small Business Investment Company Awards, it does very well. But one of the weakest areas has been in venture capital investment growth in the recent period, where the state ranks 39th. And without a traditional venture capital base here in the state, and with many banks becoming more risk adverse and not willing to lend to early stage companies that are being formed, this is a real challenge for the state of Arizona. This is one of the components that we include in there, venture capital investment in clean technology. And Arizona, I think, is recognized for having a lot of major assets, that this could be an important industry of the future, especially in the solar area. But it must be competitive with its regional peers. Here the state ranks 18th overall, but it falls behind Colorado, New Mexico, and even Nevada, which was 11th. And it's really utilizing the industry, research, and government forces that will allow Arizona to garner the venture capital, not only from within state, but from around the country, that's really going to make this an important industry, I think, in the future. But it requires investment. The next major component is human capital. And we have a number of different measures in here. I think there are 18 different components. But it looks at degrees granted on a per capita basis. So a stock is the percent of the adult population with a bachelor's degree or above, as well as flow measurements. So it looks at recent graduation rates in the science and technology fields relative to overall those demographic components. So the star performance here, Colorado, which is 3rd overall, Utah, Virginia all do very well. Minnesota does very well. And here's Arizona's weakest ranking throughout all the indicators that we reviewed. The state comes up 35th overall. And this is a key component for long-term economic success. And Arizona, if it wants to be globally competitive in the future, it must develop its homegrown skilled workers here and not be so dependent upon importing them from other places around the country and around the world. One of the weakest areas in the measurement criteria was per capita state appropriations for higher education. Arizona is in the bottom 10 in this category, and if it wants to be a leader in technology-based economic development, it cannot be in the bottom 10. Increasing the funding of higher ed and K through 12 is absolutely critical. And let me just mention, you have to include K through 12 funding because you have to educate the parents on the changing dynamics of today's economy. And if you don't get kids at an early age and get them interested in science and technology, you may never get them. So it's vitally important to think of science and technology, STEM as it's called, in the K through 12 system as well. Now, the technology and science workforce components, there's 18 different occupational categories that are included, but the 3 main categories are computer and information sciences, life and physical sciences, and engineering. And Arizona does better here than in the human capital measures because it comes up 23rd overall, about in the middle of the pack, as opposed to 35th on the human capital. One of those reasons is because Arizona has done a fairly good job in attracting talent from around the country, and it's been able to make up for this deficiency. But unless you're creating the human capital within the state that allows companies to recruit locally and they don't have to incur the costs of recruiting from long distance, you place yourself at a competitive disadvantage. One of Arizona's strengths is the intensity of engineers. Arizona ranks 6th nationally, and much of this success is due to companies such as Intel that have set up major operations here, and others as well. But Arizona must move to more of an indigenous human capital development formula. The last component looks at technology outcomes. Here we're talking about companies that are formed, grown, the jobs that are associated with those. And Arizona has done fairly well in recent years, ranking 11th overall, although the state has lost some momentum in recent years. And this chart gives you an idea of this. This only goes through 2007, but what it shows is that Arizona is basically slipped below the national average in terms of growth in high-tech industries. Overall, Arizona comes up 19th. and leaves it behind other western states such as Colorado, Oregon, Utah, and New Mexico. And in fact, in our latest index we'll be releasing in about a month, Utah has moved up to 5th. So the competition is intense in the West and becoming even more intense. Now some will ask me, you're an economist, you threw up a bunch of numbers. What do they really mean? Well, I think this is a way to try and demonstrate it. If you look at the per capita income of the working employment, people that are employed in the country, versus how they score on the Tech and Science Index, you'll find a very strong correlation. You can explain about 3/4 of the variation of per capita income across states based upon how well they score on the State Technology and Science Index. And even more critical is the human capital measures, such as the percent of the adult population with a bachelor's degree or above is the most significant single explanatory variable in determining that. Now the study, and I believe you have an executive summary with you that was handed out, I'm just going to go through 5 kind of general recommendations that we came up with. The existing clusters in Phoenix and Tucson are very important in terms of concentrating expertise and suppliers and also bringing talent from outside the state. So a key focus has to be on creating incentives for emerging companies to base themselves in these strategic locations. And expanding the support of business incubators could provide many of the facilities and connections that these firms need. And there have been great strides made in terms of technology commercialization, especially at Arizona State University. We do have a number of different other indices that show the Arizona State has improved significantly in recent years. And universities need to be encouraged, incentivized to work more closely with key employers and really contingent upon those firms making large in-state investments. And building on the existing medical school, but I would also say here in the Phoenix metro area that a greater partnership between Arizona State and clinical institutions is really going to be critical to providing the connections to advance in the life sciences. Engineering and applied sciences need to make a concerted effort to increase the number of degrees and to retain more of those graduates. This is one of the critical elements for Arizona to be successful in the future. You need to find partnerships for students and locally based firms, many of them smaller, that will provide a network opportunity not only for the students, but to keep those firms in state so the venture capitalists don't come in from California or from Massachusetts and insist that the intellectual property be moved there. So that's absolutely critical. And so a combination of state funding and partnerships with the private sectors, from endowed chairs to scholarships in crucial fields, are really important. And if you want to keep and grow high-tech companies by providing coordinated assistance, this is one of the elements that we uncovered coming and visiting and speaking to lots of people. There really needs to be a centralized group that people can go to that understand how to navigate the pathways. One idea might be the new Arizona Commerce Authority to help provide some of that assistance. There could be others. I know Science Foundation Arizona does a lot of work here as well. But Arizona really needs to dedicate itself to trying to help small companies gain access to early stage capital and the talent that they need to succeed. I talked a little bit about green technology or solar. This is a bet that I think Arizona should place. It has all the major components for success in the future. It should look at providing incentives, perhaps for utilities, for not only the construction of renewable energy plants, but for purchasing materials from plants that are from in-state manufacturers. That could go a long way towards helping. And then lastly, and it's really not last, you need to have a comprehensive strategic plan that involves government, industry, and universities, and you have to guarantee that funding over multiple years. Having a technology-based economic development strategy is the first step, but effective execution must involve the stakeholders in the governor's office, the legislature, regional development agencies, and the business communities, as well, working with Arizona's universities. And that strategy needs to be reviewed every 2 to 4 years because things will change in the real world and things need to be reevaluated. So I'd encourage a reevaluation every 2 to 4 years and leveraging the organizations that you already have, such as Science Foundation Arizona and the new Arizona Commerce Authority, because Arizona really needs to move from 35th on human capital to certainly be in the top 15, I think, to be successful over the long term. The state has a number of assets. Its universities are increasingly recognized for the quality of their research. It has several high-tech employers, many of them with operations in California, that have chosen to come here because this is a more business-friendly state than California, and it must do more to leverage those. And education is really the critical element to be successful in leveraging all that. And I thank you for your time. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Ross. And there is, you all got the executive summary, but there's a complete body of work backing up each of the recommendations, and anyone that would like that, just you can email me, and we'll get that to you. I'd like to introduce Bill Harris. Bill is the president of the Science Foundation Arizona. He's the former president of Science Foundation Ireland, and he's the former assistant director of the National Science Foundation for Math and the Physical Sciences in Washington, D.C., and before that was a successful academic leader and so forth. So, Bill.
Thank you very much. Dr. Crow gave me instructions that I had 5 minutes. And as a former academic, I'm used to 45, so I actually wrote some points down to stay close to the targeted timeline. But first, I appreciate being here with President Crow. And it's really a distinct honor for Science Foundation Arizona to be able to host this discussion today with Governor Bush on behalf of, with ASU and with Viva. This is bringing the community together in new ways and important ways for our future. And what I have done over the past several days is done a lot of reading about Governor Bush and the state of Florida. Even though I visited the state many times and have a lot of friends there, I wanted to sort of get behind the scenes and find out what the similarities were. And what I found is that there are more similarities than differences in terms of our problems. But I also found there's a couple of differences. One is they have water. We have the sand. And so somehow or another, I think there's a natural marriage here that we can try to figure out how to facilitate. So we really do welcome Governor Bush here, and we look forward to the conversation today. What I think is important from the take-home message of my reading of the Florida, particularly Enterprise Florida activity that Governor Bush initiated, was the fact that Floridians and Arizonans have much in common in terms of what they want. They want a good education for their children. They want a good life. They'd like good jobs, and they'd like to have a successful country. And I think that is what's bringing a focus on everything nationally. And it's time that we begin to look at those in a serious way. And we find a way to perhaps benefit from his success in Florida and taking a new look at education and challenging the educational system, not to be proficient, but to really perform. And some of the ideas that he's put in place there, we're going to borrow overtly in Arizona and talk to you about them, but they are really to be commended. We have for too long accepted mediocrity. We've accepted the fact that we can be in the middle of the pack and we'll still be great and innovative. And ladies and gentlemen, that's just not true. That's not how the world works. Nothing stays the same. You either go up or you go down. And what we've been doing is coasting for, I'll say, 20 or 30 years since the publication of A Nation at Risk by the National Science Foundation. We've accepted mediocrity, and we've done a great disservice to our children. And for that, we owe I'd say, a big shame on us for not being more mindful of excellence and being committed to excellence. And for that, Governor Bush in particular, I credit you for a determined focus on what A means. One of the things that's also true is our states have historically been the laboratories of democracy. And that's one of the things that I hope we can talk about today, because we need to do some new experiments, and we need to get into the game of the 21st century in a more realistic way. reality is you have to press yourself. You have to push the bar higher. And you have to recognize, all of us, that the world has really changed. And many of us, if you talk to my colleague Craig Barrett, I'm not sure if he's here yet or not, he's here. He will tell you, or he will emphasize, that we're still competing as the 1980s. It is not 1980. And when you brought in China and India, 3 billion people into the capitalistic system, who work hard and study hard and have ambitions in science and engineering, they have changed the nature of the game. And it's our time to step up and enter that game. One of the things that pleased many of my colleagues at the Science Foundation this past year, and many of our colleagues throughout the state, is that Battelle Institute does an annual report or report card about Science Foundation Arizona. And it noted the incredible progress and success and the achievements in a relatively short period of time, and how well we've leveraged the money that's been given to us by the state and by the private sector. The returns were really astounding, and they said something like that. That was picked up somehow or another by INC magazine. And we were cited this spring, along with a few places like San Diego, Phoenix and Science Foundation, that have created a culture and planted the seeds for having a true entrepreneurial economy. We really need to recognize that all the seeds are here, as Dr. Crow said earlier. We just need to step up and play the game in a serious way. One of the important elements in playing the game, I believe, is going to be the Arizona Commerce Authority. The state has for years struggled with a traditional Department of Commerce, and they were playing a game, I'll say, of the 1980s. They were handicapped with at least one hand tied behind their back, maybe two, and they were told to do things that were impossible to do, and do it with very little resources. And particularly when you read what Governor Bush did with the enterprise approach of Florida, you'll see how handicapped we were. Well, this past spring, Governor Brewer announced the establishment of the Arizona Commerce Authority, which is going to replace the Department of Commerce, and it's going to become a true public-private partnership, determined to get us into the game of the 21st century and to compete globally. Jerry Colangelo, who's going to be chairing that group, is here, and I think what his plans are, and what the governor's plans are very closely parallel to what some of the ideas that Governor Bush put in place with Enterprise Florida. I think our approach will be a little bit different, but I think the ideas benefited greatly Governor Bush from the work you did, and again, that's something we hope to talk about more today. Science Foundation Arizona is barely 4 years old. In addition to the research and the jobs that have been created through that in the companies, we've been given responsibility for STEM education. And I don't think anybody in this room could probably spell STEM a year or two ago, but it's now the topical word in business circles around the country. Basically, it's understanding at a useful level science and mathematics. Having a country that is literate in science and mathematics and can do things. This year, the state was in the race to the top competition. We were in the lower part of the first competition. We almost won the second competition, and in that second competition was a strong commitment to STEM education. We have the responsibility to help lead that on behalf of the state. I keep talking to the governor's staff and say you ought to ask for a recount, because I think it was that close that we might have won. The last thing I want to do is, again, challenge us all today to really step up and raise the bar. We owe it to our children, our grandchildren, and to the nation that has built and served us so well. Don't accept mediocrity any longer. Don't accept the fact that there are only simple solutions. It's time to suit up and get into the game of the 21st century, and I don't think anybody's better able to do that than us. Governor Bush, it's really a pleasure to have you here today. Let me turn the microphone over to Michael Crow again.
So we're going to shift to the panel discussion. As I said, the governor's not going to be giving a speech. We thought it might be more interesting for him just to be involved in answering questions and so forth. So on the panel, we have Governor Jeb Bush, who's flown here from somewhere. And we've got Sue Clark-Johnson, who's the executive director of the Morrison Institute at ASU, the former president of Gannett Newspapers, and the former publisher of the Arizona Republic, who almost broke her leg getting up on the stand here.
It's a big step.
And Bill Harris, who you've already met. And then me. So, Governor,
Thanks for the invite.
Yes. So I don't know if people really understand, where Florida was when you became governor, the kinds of overall ideas that you had about education, K through 12 education, science and technology stuff. Can you just sort of set the conditions, the state of conditions at the time that you came into office, and then sort of what your plans were and what you tried to accomplish?
So in 1998, the only measurement I'm aware of that's accurate, or at least is used as the benchmark of measuring states around the country, is the NAEP scores, the National Academic Education Progress Test, which is administered every year now. Back then, in 1999, not all states participated because accountability wasn't required. That came in with No Child Left Behind. Florida had been participating, and we were, in 1998, the year before I got elected, we were 29th out of 31 in fourth grade reading. And Arizona was ahead of us, by the way, not below, if anybody's worried about that. And on 8th grade, we were relatively close to that. So we were at the bottom of the pack. We had the lowest graduation rate in the country. Still have a abhorrently low graduation rate in my mind, but it was the 50th on the little chart that Milken chose to embarrass all the states that are closer to 50 than one. We were 50, consistently 50, and we didn't have any accountability. We didn't collect data. There was no consequence between failure, mediocrity, and success. It's just kind of the way, which is really the norm in our country even today. I think there's a complacency about this. There is what my brother called, and I think this was probably his most classic line, the idea of the soft bigotry of low expectations. So like Arizona, Florida's a very diverse state, incredibly diverse. We're now a majority-minority student population. So we implemented a suite of reforms, and the net result was that 10 years later, we're now 6th out of 50 in fourth grade reading. 50 being bad, 6 being good. And if you just took Florida's Hispanic kids, which is a sizable percentage of the student population, they come from all over, predominantly lower income. If you take Florida's Hispanic kids, we're better than or equal than 33 states. Florida's low-income Hispanic kids in the fourth grade NAEP scores is better than the California average. Florida's low-income Hispanic kids, sadly now, is, I think, better than the Arizona fourth grade average. The point, apart from a chance to brag and all that, the point of this, though, is that lessons learned, because we do have very many similar things. Michael, we're a state of people moving in and people moving out. Florida traditionally has the highest number of people moving in. What people don't know is it has the third highest number of people moving out. So, I mean, it's turbulent. It's why it's kind of a wacky place. It's where you read, headlines come from Florida, because it's not as connected as more mature states. And with all that turbulence, it seems to me that the one thing that really matters is getting the K-12 system right, because then you want to create a crisis to answer the Milken question, which is how can you create homegrown talent? The only way you can do that is to raise expectations, have higher standards, create a crisis of qualified students ready to go to college. To me, my whole objective was, for the K-12 reforms, was let's create a huge crisis that we have so many qualified students that are qualified, not by lowering standards and doing remedial work, which has kind of been the norm in Florida. Community colleges, 60% of the students take remedial courses. All but the University of Florida, a sizable percentage have to either take math or English to be able to be qualified for college-level courses. I wanted to try to create, by raising expectations for all kids and then having an accountability system that rewarded improvement. We graded schools A through F based on student learning. Schools that improved got $100 per student more. Schools that failed got a voucher until it was overruled by the Supreme Court. But the point was there was a whole focus particularly on the underperforming kids, and we're one of 2 states in the country in the last 10 years that have closed the achievement gap based on race and ethnicity. Not narrowed it, not closed it. So I guess first lesson is whatever the strategy that the political sector, along with committed community leaders and business leaders, make, it ought to be aspirational and it ought to be long-term. You got to stick with it, because big things aren't going to happen overnight. I know that goes against our desire for immediate gratification in our culture, our politics, life in general, 24-hour news cycle. goes against everything that is natural these days, but you have to be long-term in thinking. And and then you have to just be dogged in terms of determination, just never give up. I didn't have a lot of kumbaya moments with the enemies of reform. I mean, they mortgaged, the teachers union, I think, mortgaged their building to defeat me in my reelection because they didn't like the policies that had a little harder edge accountability to them. But the results are there now for people to see. And so that's just one step. You know, our graduation rate has improved every year, but there's a long way to go in Florida, every state. I mean, for us to be benchmarking ourselves to other states, I think, is ludicrous. We should be benchmarking we're a world-class country. We should benchmark ourselves to the world. And we're not really doing that well. Our kids may be feeling good about themselves, and self-esteem is probably at an all-time high, but they aren't learning math and science, and they don't have a sense of history, and they don't have a second language, and they're not necessarily going to be fully able to take advantage of the opportunities that you all are trying to create.
There was a recent poll that said that we were #1 in confidence.
Definitely. You know.
So what about beyond education on the science and technology and the infrastructure side and that kind of stuff?
So one of the things that I would say that gives a little, if I can make a little bit of a comment, I don't want to be too disrespectful to the Milken Institute because I read all their work. I'm a total nerd about this stuff, and I admire what they do.
Ross can take it.
I do think it's okay to import talent. And, you know, you can leapfrog legacy costs. You can leapfrog, California, God bless them. What's with them? I mean, it's an incredible place with incredible talent, but every chance they have, they try to make it harder and harder for the dreamers, the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the risk takers to be successful. And you're sitting right here. So I think it would be okay to have a strategy of importation because it will be sustainable over a period of time. Florida, you know, every time that New York passes another wacky tax or New Jersey has unfunded liabilities in their pensions, who benefits? Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, because people in a free country, people can move. So the strategy as it relates to higher education was interesting, and here we do have some common ground that might apply. You may remember that the first bailout, not the big one, not the stimulus of a year and a half ago, was after 9/11. There was a downturn in the economy, and the federal government gave a slug of money to states, basically to fund the Medicaid gap. That was the principle. Half of it had to go to that. We didn't have a Medicaid gap because we were controlling our costs. Arizona does a pretty good job on its Medicaid costs as well. And so we took that money and created a $500 million fund. We didn't borrow money like California did for stem cell research. We took $500 million and said, we're going to create a life science strategy. I went out to Scripps, and what didn't take too much to lure them because they couldn't grow anymore where they are. They weren't leaving La Jolla, but they can't grow because it takes an act of God to build something in La Jolla. Plus, there's not much space left. So we told communities, you match our dollars, dollar for dollar, so that there's skin in the game, and we'll get a private research institute to come, and then maybe more. So the legislature went along with this. So we took one-time monies, instead of doing the traditional thing, which is spend one-time monies on ongoing recurring costs, we took one-time monies and spent them over a 10-year period to lure, and it turned out, with local community support, to lure Scripps Research Institute. They now have a 230,000-foot building in northern Palm Beach County. The Burnham Research Institute that has common ties with Arizona State through very generous donors. It's not called the Burnham, it's called the Sanford Burnham, excuse me, yes. Research Institute that moved to Orlando. Max Planck moved to co-locate next to Scripps. The Oregon Life Science from Germany, from Munich. The Oregon, an Oregon Therapeutic Institute that's tied to the University of Oregon moved to Port St. Lucie. And one more, the Torrey Pines Research Institute, went to Port St. Lucie as well. And so this ends up being about a $2 billion investment. So we took one-time monies of $500 million, and it's leveraged up to about $2 billion of investment. We're not picking winners and losers, which I think is an important part of the strategy. I don't think government or even well-intended people get it as well as just letting the marketplace work. What we did, though, was do what the marketplace can do, which is to create world-class science. And so here's the interesting thing. I thought when we did this, Mr. President, that your colleagues would go nuts, because we weren't divvying up the money the traditional way of saying, okay, we're going to give 40% to ASU and 40% to AU and then 20% to Northern Arizona State or whatever. You know, the traditional thing is you kind of divide the pie up like they're crumbs that are given out. We gave it to these world-class institutions, and our universities supported this even though they weren't necessarily getting any money. It turns out they ended up getting a lot more money because of their cooperation, and the collegiality has created linkages that I think over the long haul will yield higher wage jobs.
The University of Florida has built an institute in Orlando near the Sanford
Next to
Burn.
Burn. Right? That's right. So it was a surprise. It was a very pleasant surprise to me that the university saw this as well as part of their mission to help change our economy, to shift it towards a more diversified, higher wage economy. But for that, we probably wouldn't have been able to get it done.
Mm-hmm.
Governor Bush, I'm interested, you were talking about not having kumbaya moments with everyone as part of this process.
I'm not very good at that either, so it didn't,
so
fit my profile.
How did you go about creating the engagement in this process among the citizens of your state, and how did you generate the political will for this?
Well, the will part was pretty easy because that was my part. That was my contribution. I willed it.
You wanted it to happen.
I mean, basically, I ran for office saying, we're going to grade schools A through F, 100% based on student learning. We're going to create a voucher if schools are F-rated. We're going to give $100. I said what I was going to do as a candidate. And then, surprise, surprise, I actually went to the legislature and said, okay, you know, I got elected, now there's a mandate here, and just by determination, we got it passed. And then the other thing that I think is a lesson learned is passing provocative legislation is easier than it looks. Implementing, executing does require some more personal engagement and more involvement, because the institutional opposition to change is powerful. Even when it's not really defendable, it's still powerful. It's easy to play defense. So, you know, that was harder. I have tire marks on my forehead along the way. All the opponents of this harder edge accountability, particularly for K-12, wanted it to fail. And many of the people that we asked to implement it were wanting it to fail. The higher ed strategy, the life science strategy, was not as, or the economic development strategy through Enterprise Florida was not as contentious.
Describe Enterprise Florida so people know what that is.
Enterprise Florida is a public-private partnership that replaced the Department of Commerce, done with my predecessor. He had actually, I think he beat me in '94. So in '95, he proposed this, and I helped him get it passed because I thought it was important to do. And it doesn't have some of the mind-numbing rules that the government places. With all due respect, it didn't have the public records request requirements. So deal flow can be done confidentially. It leveraged private money with the existing funding, and it had benchmarks that the legislature watched over to see if it was doing its job. So
what was the public investment?
Public investment has varied. We have an innovation fund as part of this life science strategy that's now broader than life science. So, it's probably about 80 million, 100 million now. It ramps up as you do the inducements, which we found to be pretty important in our little world. Georgia, one of the interesting things is that every state around us has an income tax. So the way they do economic development, I guess you could do it here too with an income tax, is you take say you're going to create 200 jobs, you take 10 years of income tax that you were going to get if those jobs were taken, bring it forward, in essence, and give it as an inducement to the business. So we didn't have an income tax. It was kind of hard we couldn't give away something we didn't have. So we had to appropriate money to compete. And the southern states have a tradition of being quite competitive. I think this stuff is important on the margins, I mean, in a strategic way. If you're trying to be all things to all people, inducements end up being like funding football stadiums and things like that, which I'm not a big fan of either. I hope I didn't offend anybody here. But, you know, there's a... Well, we did that too, just for the record. So. I'm a sinner. Praise Jesus.
I have a follow-up question. You talked about having to stick with it.
Yeah.
And your educational quality scores are extraordinarily impressive. Since 2002, Florida moved from a low rank of 47th to 29th last year. During that same period, Arizona dropped from 44 to 50, so we're dead last. But you've had some of the same political and certainly economic transitions over the same period of time as Arizona has. How have you been able to stay the course?
Well, are you talking about funding, or sometimes you got to be careful about these funding numbers, because if you have a low student population because you have a high elderly population, which on one of those charts you guys showed that I would have given you a 15-yard penalty on it, because it's really not fair. You should be doing, I think the measurement is per student funding. And maybe Arizona's low there, and so is Florida. It's slightly below the national average. And we tried to hold harmless the education budget, and my successor has done his best to do the same. So we have flat funding per student because that's the highest priority. It's the only way for a governor, the way you do that is you have to constrain Medicaid, because that's the big gorilla that eats up all the bananas. And then you can't be all things to all people. About a month and a half ago, I was in Singapore doing some work, and the Minister of Finance gave a speech, and he said, the Singapore way is to advocate and implement limited government, but activist limited government doing a few things really well. I love that. Because, first of all, you're limiting, when you live in government, you're going to expand freedom for people. You're not going to be imposing, being all things to all people means you're putting huge burdens on a group of people. Ultimately, that decision's made by, who you want to, tax and regulate. But you really should be good at the things that are your high priority. You can't be limited government that does things really bad. That's not a mission statement. If you believe in limited government, then pick the things that you really want to be known for and be the best at it. And that's what we tried to do with economic development and K-12 education, and then the life science strategy was an example of that. And I think having limited government DNA is a good thing, because it does give you, for example, we have, this will sound really nerdy, but it ended up creating the opportunity for us. We have a 5% reserving policy on every trust fund. We limited non-recurring monies that were taken in to be spent on recurring obligations. So we didn't get into a hole like California does every year. They keep playing like they're balancing their budget, but they're using non-recurring revenue to fill holes that are of recurring expenses. That's not sustainable. So we put a limit on that. We put a debt service limit. We're the only state that went from AA to AAA in the last 10 years because we had all of these constraints. We eliminated, I was called Veto Corleone, because I vetoed line items in the budget. We didn't allow for the legislature to try to be all things to all people. We really tried hard to limit it. So when I left, there was $9 billion of cash. And we were spending, our revenue, recurring revenue rate was actually higher than recurring expenses. I don't believe there's a state in the country that had that. So we shouldered.
How did you launch multiple medical schools at the same time?
Well, that's not recurring. Actually, it is recurring money to a certain extent. The good times were rolling, man. We did this in a context of good times. It was part of the strategy of building on the life science initiative. It made sense, and the clustering effect that's taking place now in Orlando, in Medical City, which, if you're ever interested in seeing something that was a pasture land, and now from a standing start, my guess is $2 billion of investment in one place.
So why is Disney World not enough for Orlando?
Same reason that all these really cool golf courses aren't good enough for Arizona. You have to, it's not sustainable. As we've seen now with the downturn, Florida's having difficult times. This is a long-term strategy. We don't have the diversity that would have shielded us somewhat from the downturn because we're not in the dynamics sector of the economy to the extent that ultimately we will be.
So, Governor Bush, the good times were rolling, as you said,
Yeah.
and now we have tough times. You made your investment efforts when the good times were very, very good. If you were doing it today, if you were starting over today in the kind of economic environment that both Florida and Arizona exist in, how would you do it today?
I would do the same thing. I would take out. Where's Intel Man? Craig, where are you? Craig, you know.
He makes us call him Intel Man.
So, you know, I would follow the lead of great CEOs. If you know, a downturn is it's an opportunity to transform. Every great leader that I've talked to, and I try to steal their ideas, and because it's cool to hang out with really successful people that manage complex organizations. Downturns are hugely important for disruption and change and making things better. So I actually feel a little melancholy that I didn't get I had a small downturn. I wish I had a really good one, because it would have given the opportunity to, for example, as ASU struggles with its funding for the brick and mortar part of the school, your president is looking at expanding digitally, virtually, where the capital costs, which may not be available today because of the downturn, give him that opportunity. We'd be hitting it on all cylinders in that regard to challenge every basic assumption about how government should work and not miss the opportunity of the downturn to be prepared for the better times. So, there's a lot of, oh, woe is me, oh, this is bad, but there's a lot of whining going on. There's a cloud over our country. I think there's a lot of pessimism, and my attitude is look at the leaders that aren't whining, that are innovating and challenging, like your president here, and like many CEOs in the room, that are transforming their enterprises as a model for state governments.
I think there's work for you in the state.
If you get born in Florida. First, I'm impressed that that even in today's times you see the importance of science and technology. If you're going to get to the future, you're competing with every other state, but you're really competing with every country in the world. And I guess one of the things I would be curious about is, as you said earlier, we compete with 1 through 50 in our states. Yet we've got Europe, we've got Asia. We ignore at our peril. How do you see developing at a state level say a science and tech policy that advances the state when you've been so dominated by the federal government for so many years?
Well, there's two things I'd say about that. One, on November 3rd, more than 75% of the American population woke up with a governor-elect, a new governor. That's amazing if you think about it. So governors have to lead. They have to do things. They can't talk about their distinguished friends and all the talk of the House of Lords kind of mentality. They have to lead. They have to execute on a plan. Typically, they've run on those plans. We helped craft some of those plans as it relates to education, and I know that some of them are quite provocative. And so I think there's going to be a leading indicator of this is Chris Christie, Governor Christie. The guy, New Jersey, he's been there for a year. He's a folk hero because he's doing what he said he was going to do, and he's doing it in New Jersey style. And there's going to be other governors, Democrats and Republicans, that are doing the exact same thing. And so the first answer, I think, is our federalist system creates a real tension of competition that is very beneficial. So I wouldn't wait for Washington to show us the promised land. I think there's going to be winners and losers amongst the states, and the states that are the most forward-leaning, led by governors with a cooperative legislature, are going to be the ones that win. The second thing I'd say is there's been a phenomenal coming together, at least on K-12 education, in a meaningful way. People with trepidation and some concern, but without a whole lot of conversation and fighting and arguing, the 48 of the 50 state school officers and governors, through the National Governors Association, have signed up for Common Core standards. Common Core standards are higher, there are fewer of them, they're higher. They mean that when you graduate based on these standards from 12th grade, you're college and career ready. In America today, a third of our children graduate college and or career ready. A third graduate with a piece of paper that says they've graduated, but if they went to college, university or college, they would be taking remedial courses, and a third don't graduate at all. So moving the standards up to raise the expectations is a powerful, powerful first step. And the fact that they're common, I think, not federal, because if they were federal, it would die a very quick death, as it should. The last thing the federal government ought to be doing is creating the standards. But this is a bottom-up driven process that yields a higher set of standards and higher set of expectations that get us closer to world class. So to me, that is hugely important. And then state initiatives that are scattered all over that require, so if you have 24 credits to graduate from high school and you only have Algebra 1 as a requirement, I think, isn't it correct? That's the majority of the states. That's laughable. I mean, that's shameful. It's so far removed from reality for what a successful life looks like, an independent, successful life looks like. If that's our expectation for the next generation, we're toast, because we need young, vibrant workers to take care of us old folks as we get older together. And so raising the bar as it relates to graduation, not just as it relates to the Common Core standards, but what your expectations are. So Florida, we had a big fight. It took a lot of work to get Algebra 2 as a requirement for graduation, or biology. Many states don't have STEM standards that they could advocate publicly without being laughed at.
Well, that's the world standards question that you talked about earlier, and I think too many of the states live with the word proficient and then dumb down the curriculum for a generation of kids. So I really think your leadership there is critical.
And you know what? The other thing I'd say is really important is the higher the bar goes up,
they'll reach it.
Yeah, I mean, kids, my theory is, particularly young kids, are genius until we start socializing them, making them look like us. The more adult-like they get, the stupider they get. So if we raise expectations early enough, we'll get the desired result. That's the way the world works. High bars with a good plan to execute on what our expectations are will yield a far better result.
Well, one last question was that when I read your report for this year, now you weren't the governor, but the Enterprise Florida report had recommendations to strengthen science advisory capacity in the state. It was probably derivative of your ideas. Clearly, states, as they're going to be competing internationally and across the country, need a different kind of advice now than they probably needed a decade ago. Do you have thoughts on that or experience with that at all?
Well, this is where connecting with the universities is hugely important. And what I always hoped for was a group of university presidents that were entrepreneurial to start with, so they get it immediately. Risk-taking university presidents, hint, get it. They can drive change, because not everybody inside the academy is, they don't have the same, I don't know, it's a little slower inside there than it needs to be. I think there needs to be a sense of urgency about this, and without the presidents driving the change, you're not going to get the kind of support that universities can provide for economic development efforts. But for the presidents, my experience was that the presidents and the boards of trustees make it a high priority. You can connect the kind of advice to make your strategies wiser and quicker to deal with the opportunities.
So it's speed and brains in the 21st
Yeah,
century.
and not try to, again, be all things to all people, because the minute you start waving money in front of anybody, all of a sudden everybody's got a fantastic reason, and the tendency in the legislature particularly is to fund everything, kind of, and never be strategic in the approach. So that's where the other place where leadership plays a role is to keep keep a strategy. If you're going to build a long-term strategy, it's meaningless to have a strategy unless you execute on it. And the execution needs to adapt and change to the realities. You can't, the strategy then can't be the gravy train for everybody's great idea. It has to fund the things that you think are the important ones. And you know what happens when you do that is it builds another opportunity. Reform is never final, success is never complete. It just creates another opportunity to build on. And that kind of forward motion is what we need in government today, and particularly in economic development for our country.
So you mentioned Singapore a little while ago. It's definitely a limited government place with massive connections around the world. What is it about their ability to execute that we seem to have some issues with in various parts of the United States?
Well, some would say maybe that they don't have a whole lot of patience for idle democracy. You know, I mean, I'm not sure that's. Every time I've been there, it doesn't look like it's repressive at all.
Shorter discussion phases.
Yeah, there's not a lot of talking. It's leadership. I mean, the mentor minister and the prime minister. I mean, they have a strategic vision. The other thing they do that we've kind of lost our way on as a nation that I really admire, because this is so politically incorrect, and you got a good plan that's politically incorrect and it's just keeps going is pretty cool. In my mind, they fund the things they want more of. They incent the things they want more of. They disincent the things they want less of. Now, I know that sounds like a radical idea, but for example, their housing programs. We subsidize single-family living in as part of our housing strategy. We have huge, big commitment to rental housing, and it's typically it's not judgmental. It's non-judgmental, if you will. In Singapore, you have to be an intact family to get the subsidy. The subsidy is down payment support to buy a home. They have the largest public housing program relative to the size of their population, I guess, in the world. But it isn't a government program. It's private. Some of it's government, but they run their developments just as good as the private sector does. But you're not subsidizing ongoing. You're subsidizing a down payment so people own homes, and intact families is the only way you get into the program. So what do you get? You get more intact families, believe it or not. I know that's. Are we too far along in our development as a whatever path we're on now as a country to have that conversation? You know what? We're going to have to start having conversations like that. And Singapore seems to have gotten that figured out pretty amazingly. Sue?
Bill Harris mentioned in his opening remarks the formation of the Arizona Commerce Authority.
Yeah.
And what advice would you have for our friend Jerry Colangelo?
Jerry, raise your hand since
Jerry?
you're the chairman.
Cool job, Jerry.
Tell him how cool it's going to be.
Well, I mean, I was Secretary of Commerce in Florida and advocated the abolition of the department because I thought it could be done better in a private sector setting. And my predecessor, Governor Childs, implemented it, and I think it's worked significantly better. We split it up. We have the Visit Florida, which is our tourism public-private partnership, and then Enterprise Florida, that it's quicker to adapt to the changes. It's not tied to the way the Department of Commerce was doing it 20 years ago. You have a board of directors, I assume, rather than a governor. I hope your governor's involved, because the best salesman for any state is going to be the governor. The chief economic development officer should be the governor. Most states' governors do this as a matter of fact. The ones that don't end up kind of putting their state at a disadvantage. So you can still achieve that. You can have the governor as actively involved as he or she can do given the constraints of time, but you can run your effort as a business in essence, and you can be held to account, like for real things. I assume you're prepared to do that.
So how did the funding from the state change in the new model that you came up with?
It went up. It went up over time.
It doesn't go to zero?
No, it went up, and it stayed. It's actually, the case, after I left, we had the downturn, and their cuts were de minimis. Part of which was we used this, they used this non-recurring money that was stashed away for the rainy day. So they had that benefit of keeping their programs intact. But when times are tough is when you want to expand economic development activities. At least that was the kind of feeling we had. And then Governor Christ and the legislature doubled down on that notion. They actually increased funding for the Innovation Fund. It really only takes 2 or 3 leaders in the legislature and a governor to drive this kind of policy. It's a secret. Don't tell anybody.
Bill?
Let me go back to Singapore and Asia, which you know so well. And one of the concerns I have is the fact that it's sometimes hard for political leaders to travel. They get beat up in the newspapers, and that's a big mistake because they're then ignorant of the competition and opportunities. How did you address that?
I worked my tail off when I went. I worked like a dog. I mean, if anybody thought it was a boondoggle, I just showed them my schedule.
Yeah.
It was pretty simple.
It's too hot in Singapore for it to be a boondoggle.
But it's the mentality we have.
We took big missions. We had. I got a call from my first year. I got a call from President Cedillo, who had a really smart strategy. The California-Texas nexus to Mexico is really strong, and his interest was to create kind of a third leg of his relationship with Washington, and to do it through the states. Very astute political move, but also pretty darn astute economically because of the log jams that exist on the cross border on the western border. So he said, please come. And so we took 450 people. We had the largest trade mission that has ever gone to Mexico from the United States. And it was like, and he welcomed me kind of like a semi-head of state. And it was fantastic. And it moved the needle on trade flows and investment flows principally between the southern Mexico, the East Coast, and Florida, because we don't have a land border. We have a big lake called the Gulf of Mexico between us. So we had these high-profile visits that had some results immediately. We tried to have those so people got a sense that this was important. And then anybody that complained, I showed them my schedule, and if they could outwork me, then they could complain.
Well, I think those things are essential as we go forward, because I think, like we've accepted mediocrity in our educational system, we've accepted a belief that we're by ourselves and do anything we want. I think we need to see the competition and learn. But I think we need to embrace this important role of traveling and being the ambassadors for the state.
Absolutely.
You have to run your state like it's your country.
Yeah, and I would say, back to the notion of not trying to be all things to all people, that's a really important concept, because if you're sitting in Japan, or which is a major investor in the United States, and you want to make your case there, there's been 15 other governors in the last month that have traipsed through.
That's right.
You got to have something to say other than our taxes are lower than California's.
That's right.
Although that's still a good thing to say. No offense to my buds in California. That's not a bad thing to say, but you got to have that's where the strategic thinking, I think, that is important, where you identify your strengths and weaknesses, and you make your case for a particular area where you can be successful, where you have the ingredients for success for investment overseas, and then bring companies that are exporting to that market to show some success, because it does breed success. The more, you saw the president now in New Delhi and Mumbai. I think it's great the President of the United States is traveling. I don't have a problem with it at all. I don't know if 1,000 people, that's a tad high for an entourage, but doesn't matter. He's making, he's announcing deals. Those deals weren't done when he just showed up. The Boeing sale in India happened, a long time ago, but it shows this, for him it's good politically, but more importantly, I think it shows a forward momentum to change people's attitudes about how we can compete. And
so our chief research officer is on that trip with the president. So as are a number of university presidents from around the country.
That I think is a useful role for even the president. I mean, governors, that's the traditional role for governors, but presidents can't do that every time they travel internationally. But having I guarantee you that Sarkozy does it, David Cameron does it, every other president does it, and it's okay for our president to do it as well. So you won't find me being critical. In fact, I think it's a good thing.
I think it's good for the governors to do it too, though.
Absolutely.
Well, how do you make investments, or how do you plan investments or strategize investments in the middle of financial or economic uncertainty and recessions and all these other kinds of things that we're temporarily afflicted with?
Well, I think you have to do a couple of things. One, if you begin the process of changing how government works and focusing on a few things and doing them really well, you might be surprised that there could be added resources. You set the stage for the recovery. You challenge if Arizona has, for example, high workers' compensation costs. I have no clue if they do or don't. You can change that. You can move that needle in one law change. We had our workers' comp costs were second highest behind California in the country. With the passage of a comprehensive law change, in 1 year, our workers' comp costs went down 40%. That's hundreds of millions of dollars of savings for business. We over-litigate in Florida. We had too many lawsuits. We did tort reform. We created a better business climate that then allowed, over the long haul, to have investments. You can, even with the budget being short, as it's going to be this year, you can focus on your business climate. You can certainly make the case that you need to have high school graduation rates go up, and you need education reform, which I think that the Arizona legislature will be open to. So a lot of things that can be done. It may not be that you're going to have $1 billion fund to fund everybody's hopes and dreams here, but you can set the stage for it.
I can't help but ask how, you mentioned a little bit about the universities in terms of their role in being a part of your recruiting these private sector or not-for-profit research institutes or national laboratories. And so when you look at the universities in a strategy, what would you ask them to do?
Well, first of all, I wanted them to graduate more nurses, teachers, engineers, doctors, and fewer psychology majors. It wasn't quite successful, but I got their attention. In other words, to shift, just as you've done, Mike, to shift your priorities towards the state's priorities. Not saying how to do it, not far be it from a politician to ever dare cross the line of the academy and be accused of violating academic freedom. Even when I didn't want to do it, I got in trouble because I was thinking it or something. I don't know. That's not the point. They're very sensitive in Florida, at least. They're very sensitive about these things.
You still have all your fingers, so they never actually captured you.
But the point being that if you ask for help, my experience is that the university presidents are state leaders. They feel a state obligation, even if their institutions may be more insular than we would like them to be. If you can encourage the leadership at the top, you can get the desired results you want. So we had people want to know when you're recruiting, when people are thinking about making big investment decisions, they want to know how good your schools are and how good your universities are. That is, if that's not at the top of the list, that's pretty darn close. So if you don't have your universities there saying, here's our plan to be world-class in this area, or here's why this metropolitan university, a regional university that is generating the teachers we need, even though we have a shortage. They have a story to tell, and you make it part of your story when you're trying to convince people to invest. And along the way, you get them to be more strategic. So we eliminated the Board of Regents that was a kind of a top-down driven organization. Well, this is controversial, I can tell.
No, there's several regions here.
And it was the word eliminate they were interested in.
Hang on. I'll tell the whole story here. we created, let me try to say this positively.
There was another outcome, though.
There was. We created boards of trustees for the universities to be the monitors of the universities, the university presidents, and also to be their advocates. And we eliminated the Board of Regents, which had much more control, and created a Board of Governors, which you would have gladly wanted to be on because it was a policy-making entity that created statewide strategies for higher education, which I think is a better role than saying, no, you can't have a left-handed Albanian degree program. You must have a right-handed Croatian degree program. That's not a top...
We just started one of those.
But that was your decision, not the Board of Regents, right? That's my point. You should have that, I just think university presidents are big boys and big girls, and tell them to put on their big boy pants and big girl pants and go do it. And if they mess up,
Replace them. Exactly.